Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I will,
Hello.
yeah, I will keep my part very brief. I'm just here for the logistics. Um, as we're going through the webinar today, if you have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A or the chat anonymously or with your name, and we'll make sure whether we answer it publicly or follow up separately, we'll get you what you need. And Cheryl here is going to be moderating the Q&A. She's the Chief Patient Advocate at 1104 Health. I know many of you are familiar with us already, but we believe every patient deserves access to the best possible care, which includes clinical trials. So our shared care network helps oncologists connect patients with the right trials at the right time without getting lost in the shuffle or in the system. And so we're giving both patients and the doctors support to facilitate that and make that happen. I'll pass it over to Cheryl to talk through today's session.
Great. Well, thank you all for taking the time to join us today, probably during your lunch hour. As you know, clinical trials are essential for advancing cancer treatment. Yet only 7% of US cancer patients participate, despite 50% are eligible for trials. The problem isn't availability, it's access. The system forces community oncologists to navigate outdated processes, misaligned incentives, and overwhelming logistics, leaving many patients without life-saving options. So we're here today to kind of talk about those resources. I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers, both from the American Cancer Society, Pia Banger, oh my gosh, I'm having a moment. Banji, uh,
Banerjee.
Banerjee, sorry, and Mark Fleury. And I'm going to let them both take a few minutes to introduce themselves and their role at the American Cancer Society.
Perfect. I'll go ahead and start. So hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Pia Banerjee. It's wonderful to meet you all. And thank you so much, Shannon and Cheryl, for inviting me and Mark here as well today. I'm the Director of Cancer Innovation and Transformation at the American Cancer Society. So I oversee health innovation for the American Cancer Society's patient support pillar, and I oversee and lead a number of programs, including our mobile app, ACS Cares, and our new clinical trials matching program, ACS ACTS, which stands for Access to Clinical Trials and Support. I'm also a clinical neuropsychologist with a prior background at UCLA and St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. So it's great to be here. Dr. Fleury?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Mark Fleury. I'm a policy principal at the American Cancer Society, specifically within the Cancer Action Network, which is the policy and advocacy arm of the American Cancer Society. So our focus is really on changing public policies. So think about laws and regulations at both the federal and the state level that will help promote the development of new and better therapies. I'm trained as a basic cancer scientist, but have been working in policy and have been with ACS CAN now for about 11 years. And the last 5 or 6 has included a very deep focus on the barriers that patients face accessing clinical trials and what we can do about that from a public policy standpoint. So excited to be here today and talk about one of my favorite topics, clinical trials. Oh, I think you're on mute, Cheryl.
Sorry about that. Thank you both for joining us. I think it's going to be a great session. Let's dive right into the questions. What is your point of view on clinical trials and their role for advancing treatment? And what would you wish to tell patients?
Yeah, do you want to start, Dr. Fleury? Would you like me to?
Sure, I can start. I think we have made tremendous progress with respect to cancer. Since 1991, we've seen the death rate drop by 34%, by over a third. And that didn't just sort of spontaneously happen. It happened because of research that discovered and understood in a greater depth what causes cancer and what the vulnerabilities of individual cancers are, and then exploited that knowledge by developing therapies. but every therapy has to go through a clinical phase, and that means clinical trials and learning from patients. And so if we want better outcomes, we need to ask questions, collect data, and do that through clinical trials. And so that requires not only good ideas and good scientists, but patients willing to partake in that effort.
Absolutely. I mean, clinical trials are really essential to us being able to advance cancer treatment. And, as Dr. Fleury mentioned, every treatment that we have today exists because patients participated in trials before them. And I think that's important, to keep in mind, but also that participating in a trial is not just about helping future patients, which a lot of people think about. That's certainly one plus, but it's also about getting the most advanced care possible now that you can, if that's appropriate for you. So Cheryl, you had mentioned what we think that, what's an important message for patients. And I think the most important message I can think of right now is that trials aren't a last resort. It may be appropriate at all stages of cancer at different points throughout your treatment. And so the important thing is to be able to talk to your providers and talk to your healthcare team early to make it known that you may want to be considering a trial, because it might be the right option for you. Standard of care may also be the best option for you as well. But if you're interested in exploring, then that's something that you should make known pretty early on.
Great.
And
sorry.
I would just add to that clinical, to build on Dr. Banerjee's comment, is that clinical trials come in many different flavors. So people often think about a primary treatment trial and intervention where you're getting, say, a new experimental drug. But there are many clinical trials that, for example, may test new supportive methods while you're getting the standard of care. So how can we help alleviate your symptoms better with, diet or exercise or anti-nausea medicines or things like that. So clinical trials don't always have to be about changing, the primary treatment modality. It can be about a lot of other things. Does it work better if you take smaller doses more times or bigger doses fewer times? So there's a lot of different aspects here. And so I think, just to echo, it's not waiting until you're sort of out of options to consider clinical research.
Right. And there are even clinical trials for like long-term monitoring and observation as well. So you could be part of a registry, for example. So it's not even just looking at the doses or looking at the cutting edge treatments, but even just how you're doing long-term. It might be something that you're interested in doing and being part of that long-term observation.
I'd like to chime in with a question before we go on, because it's relevant here. Question posed of, would it be offensive to your doctor if you were to bring up clinical trials as an option when they're trying to work through a treatment plan for you?
Yeah, I would say absolutely not. Ultimately, you are the advocate for yourself and for your care. And I know some people have a little bit of that fear, right? Of, I don't know how to bring this up to my doctor. My doctor has a plan for me. Some of that also may be, if my doctor never brought it up, it must not be right for me. So I think those are two big things that we hear. So first, your doctor may not have looked into different options for you or know that there are specific options out there for you, or may simply think for whatever reason that you are not interested. And so it's very important to make that known early on. And if you don't want to be upfront about, is it a clinical trial, or maybe I want to be looking at treatment elsewhere, you can just ask questions like, are there options for me outside of standard care? And that just may prompt the idea that, oh, maybe you're interested in looking at something else. And a lot of times physicians will think about the trials at their hospital. And so they may say, we do have these 2 trials here at our hospital, but they're really not appropriate for you. And so you can go one step further as well and say, are there other clinical trials at other places as well that may be of interest? And that lets your physician or your healthcare team know that you're interested and that they can go and look on your behalf to see if there's some other options out there for you that could be good options for you to consider as well.
Yeah, I think totally agree with all of that. And, I think the question, is it offensive? I mean, I think doctors are people too, and you're going to run into a lot of different personalities. And, you may find some that are very eager and others that are less. But we did a study of about 700 providers. This was oncologists and nurses, not just oncologists. But we asked what triggered them to help their patient find a clinic. One of the top reasons, if they didn't already do so in a standardized way where they screened everybody, one of the top reasons why they took the initiative to go ahead and go that extra mile was because they were asked by the patients. So I think it's really important data point that, you know, it's your care, and setting your goals is what's of primary importance. And if you're interested, absolutely let your provider know.
Yeah, I agree. And and the important thing is it's your life. You know, this is a true life or death situation, and clinical trials are definitely near and dear to my heart. But there are a lot of myths to clinical trials. Do you want to get into that? Because a lot of people jump into a trial going, wonder if I don't get the actual drug, or I get a placebo. Can you, kind of discuss that a little bit on how that works?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly a ton of myths out there. Some of them are the ones we've touched on already, which is it's never too late for a trial, never too early for a trial. So, exploring trials throughout your treatment, regardless of the stage of your cancer or where you are in your cancer journey, is an important one. Cheryl, you just mentioned the idea of a placebo, and I think that's also another myth that a lot of people think about. In cancer clinical trials, placebos are almost never used alone. So if a trial does include a placebo, typically it's given alongside your standard of care. So nobody's going to be going untreated. And that's, I think, something else to keep in mind as well. You're never going to be without treatment unless, there was some rare situation, but you would be told what these risks are and you'd be educated on what that is at that point in time. But I have not seen any cancer clinical trial where that's the case. There are certainly a number of other myths, and I know Dr. Fleury probably has some as well to bring up. One of them might be that it's too risky, or that they'll feel like they're a guinea pig. We do hear that sometimes. And I think just knowing about the history of how the clinical trial got to where it is at that point is important to think about, that it's undergone extensive testing in a lab. There's been earlier studies that have been done on it, and they are always, always educated about the risks, that the trials are following really strict safety protocols throughout, that you're being monitored very closely, sometimes more closely than even in standard of care. So making sure that that all of these risks that are there are laid out to you, you're educated on this front, and that you'll be monitored and watched throughout, and that these are not just entirely new things that haven't been thought about or tested or gone through research beforehand. Also, the expense is another big thing that I think we hear about as well. But something to know about is that your costs are typically covered by your trial. And that could even include your transportation to get to the trial, could include lodging, it could include the food that you need while you're actually traveling to that trial. And your insurance may also be covering some of the standard of care components of that trial as well. So I think these are certainly important ones, as well as the fact that from a consent perspective, you're always in control and can leave that trial at any point if you don't feel like it's the right fit for you. So those are some of the myths that I think of. And Dr. Fleury, you may have others as well.
I just wanted to sort of echo the comment about risks, both with respect to placebos or potentially that the drug itself is risky, and that every clinical trial by law must be reviewed by what's called an institutional review board, or an IRB. And in order for it to move forward, there has to be determination that there is no more risk to a patient to enter a clinical trial than if they got standard of care. So it's a graduated process, right? The phase 1 is really exploratory trial. Phase 2, you're getting the doses right. Phase 3, you're really trying to determine efficacy. And before each step is moved forward, an independent panel of people who are not involved with the sponsor have to look at this and agree this is ethical, that you're not exposing the patient to any more risk than if they were to seek standard of care. And so that design has to be reviewed. A myth, a new one, I guess, that maybe I will introduce, and it's not necessarily a patient myth as much as it is a system myth. And I think it was touched on before by Cheryl about access, but we often hear, I was part of the study that, found that 7% of oncology patients enroll in cancer clinical trials. And sometimes the immediate reaction is, why aren't the other 93%, enrolling? And it's not, well, the low participation rate is not for a lack of interest. It is really for a lack of access. We did a study that showed on average, 75% of patients, or 3 out of 4 patients who walk through the door, will never be offered a clinical trial. And so you can't say yes. So one of the big things we're doing from a policy standpoint is trying to understand how more patients will have the opportunity to say yes. We know that the average acceptance rate, if you're eligible and a provider or a nurse or somebody says, here's a spot in a trial, would you like to enroll in it? Here's what the trial is about. The average acceptance rate is 55%, so more will say yes than say no. I think that's one important thing to understand, is that patients generally are interested in enrolling in trials, and that the lack of opportunity is really one of the biggest barriers we see.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of where patients get stuck, and it really kind of goes down to access and information, and maybe being cancer illiterate, right? Because this is something that nobody kind of prepares for. But what are some of the tools and ways that we can work to improve a patient's access and help them understand what's available out there for their particular type of cancer?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple different layers of that, from, first of all, the policy level, right, down to the actual patient level. So I'll speak to the patient level component of that. And that there's a number of clinical trial matching programs out there. ACS Acts, as I mentioned, is one of those, which if you're interested, you can access by going to cancer.org/acts, ACTS. And that's one that offers you, on the front end of access, the actual education about clinical trials. So if you don't know what a clinical trial is, you want to just learn more about clinical trials, we have our cancer information specialists who can help you understand more about clinical trials in general. And then at that point, we would help you with AI-based clinical trials matching, which is where they would help you with one of these barriers that we haven't really talked about, is some of the actual logistics of gathering all of your medical records together and actually finding out, based on my biomarker testing, or do I even have biomarker testing, am I actually eligible for this trial? So having people, or having navigators or other healthcare team members, or in this case for ACS Acts, some other individual who can help you navigate through collecting those records and finding out what trials you are actually eligible for. Because clinicaltrials.gov is where a lot of these sources are, but it's very difficult and challenging to navigate for any individual, even for us in this space, to go and find a trial. So use these resources for you as well. And then in ACS Acts, we have the wraparound at the end as well, to provide the free lodging and transportation if it was not covered by your trial, to ensure that we actually break down the barriers to participation to that trial as well. So that's an example of one program, but there are many programs out there. And you can start even with your healthcare team to understand what trial options are there for you and what resources are available to you for that.
Yeah, and so sort of to complement Dr. Banerjee's, ideas about how a patient can sort of self-activate and solve some of those problems. As I mentioned at the outset, my focus is more public policy. So how can we create a system where sort of a patient doesn't have to roll the stone uphill, so to speak, to get into a clinical trial, but instead it becomes, a much easier process. Maybe I'll use an example of one win that we had several years ago as an example of how we think about that. It used to be that insurance companies, if you enrolled in a clinical trial, they deemed the care, experimental, and then they would not cover any cost whatsoever related to the clinical trial. And just as a background, the trial sponsors pay for whatever is experimental. So let's say, for example, you're a breast cancer patient and you would normally get a surgery, and then afterwards you might get a drug, and the new clinical trials is testing a different drug. Well, you still would get your surgery and you'd still get, scans and lab work and stuff like that. So the clinical trial only pays for the new drug, not all the what we call routine or standard care. And years ago, insurance companies could use your enrollment on a clinical trial as a reason just to say, oh, we're not going to cover anything. But with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, it required most private insurance plans to cover those routine care costs, because they would pay for it anyway. If you weren't in a clinical trial, you would still get your surgery, you would still get the scans. And then the trial sponsor is responsible for that, experimental portion. So, through public policy advocacy, we got that passed in the Affordable Care Act, but Medicaid was still a huge source of insurance that did not cover routine care costs. Fast forward a few years later, I think it was 2021, we passed a piece of legislation that required all Medicaid plans to cover that routine care costs. So these are examples where, as from a policy standpoint, we identified barriers that took otherwise willing people who said, I'd love to enroll in a clinical trial, but suddenly insurance essentially drops me when I do. We've eliminated those. And so we continue to do things related to that. We're trying to work on policies that make it easier for patients to receive financial support while on clinical trials. Right now, if you're a patient and you're on a trial and you receive like a stipend to help offset some of your costs, you could be taxed on that stipend. And if you're eligible for things like Medicaid or insurance subsidies, that support could push you out of eligibility and cause you to be dropped by Medicaid. And we're trying to address policies like that. So the way I think about it is sort of some of these system level issues. And the last thing I'd mentioned that we're really working on is trying to understand how we can get more clinical trials into the community. But for some of the smaller community sites, it's hard. So we're trying to understand how we can make trials so they're more decentralized, so you could maybe get most of your care closer to home or do it via telemedicine and things like that. So a variety of ways that we're thinking about improving those access opportunities.
Do you guys know, do you know that if most of the clinical trials that are coming up now, do they allow for telehealth? I know when I was enrolled, I had several of those problems, Xing out my insurance as well as having to physically be at the trial site. Are we seeing that change now?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and one of the perhaps silver linings, if there is such a thing as a silver lining of a pandemic, is that I've been in this space for 11 years, and we talked about one day we're going to have decentralized clinical trials where you can have telemedicine visits and et cetera. We kept talking about one day, and that one day kept going, years passed and one day never came. When the pandemic arrived, that one day arrived. We saw very rapid shifts, both from a policy standpoint. FDA and NCI both created permissive policies to allow it to take place rather easily. And the clinical trial sponsors figured out ways to do it. And we saw a tremendous uptake in telemedicine and shipping even some of the sample drugs or the study drugs to people's homes so they didn't have to come into a pharmacy. The downside is that while we thought, okay, now this was the proving point that we can do clinical trials in a more remote way. I mean, there's certain things, right? If you need an MRI or if you need a surgery, you can't do that with telemedicine at home. So there's always going to be a need, especially in oncology, to go in. But could we reduce that? So we saw great uptake, and we hoped it would be sticky, so to speak. And when the pandemic ended, that we would see those practices continue. And we have to some degree, but there's been a significant sort of backslide back to the status quo. So, so I think we know the art of the possible now, but it's not. It hasn't been as sticky, so to speak, as we thought. And there's still some, residual policy issues, things like, doctors can't practice across state lines and things like that via telemedicine. So we're still working on some of the policies there, but it is more of an option than it used to be. But we're somewhere between someday and we're here.
Mm-hmm. And just to chime in here from the 1104 Health side, I know we're speaking today to patients and caregivers, but we're trying to work on increasing the connectivity through online, I'm not going to call it televisit because it's doctors, but they can curbside consult each other and maintain continuity of care for the patients, which would allow for the treatment setting to be more convenient for the patient, and the doctors are still connected, which would be, exciting. And I wanted to touch on something. There was a question posed a bit ago. Pia, you touched on this, but just to make sure I answer this for this person. The question was, how is this group thinking about technology-assisted patient screening for clinical trials?
Yeah, so I think, Dr. Fleury was talking about the telehealth component of this. So this is really where the advantage of technology comes into play. And it does need to be met also on the federal level to make sure that we have some unity as we're able to move forward, because this has to be approved in some ways from FDA and such as well. But we need to be making sure that we do have technology to be able to screen for trials and be able to, as much as we can, decentralize things that don't actually have to be done in person. So if things can be done via telehealth, if things can be done from a screening based on patient-reported outcome measures, which is a fancy way of saying you get on your tablet or your computer and you answer some questionnaires there. These are certainly some things that are being able to be moved forward. A lot of the research has been done on the back end to actually develop what these questionnaires look like. So these are validated questionnaires that exist that allow us to measure and track some outcomes as you move forward. And so there's certainly some improvement in the space to being able to actually allow these screenings and allow these questionnaires to be done from home. But I do think that we have a long way to go. And this has to be done also on the federal level, as Dr. Fleury is doing, as well as on the patient level and the research level as well.
And I'll just add that we did a survey and about 5 years ago now, and obviously things have changed, but the same survey I mentioned before, we asked providers how they screen for clinical trials, and it was overwhelmingly manual, right? Is like we heard things, there's a whiteboard in the break room with like the clinical trials listed, and sort of the nurses just sort of knew in their head what they were. So we were not seeing a lot of technology employed to do those initial pre-screens. We have at ACS Can, we have a pilot study called Blue Button. It's meant to integrate into the EHR and just press a button and get a quick screen. But we have seen in the last couple of years just an explosion of AI and more technology. But I'm still surprised that we're 2025 and how much clinical trial matching is still a manual process. So I think this is a great place that we can still make a lot of progress.
There was one final question posed as we were talking, and then we'll wrap it up. This is from the audience saying, the question is, if you aren't a perfect fit, meaning you might have some disqualifying elements, does that mean you shouldn't bother to apply?
I love that question. Yes. Go ahead.
That's a great question.
Absolutely not, I think, is what all of us are saying. You should absolutely apply for any of these and be able to continue through the process. What I like to think about clinical trials as is, you want to find the one that's the right fit for you. So think about it maybe like trying on shoes, right? So you don't want one that's too tight or one that doesn't give you the arch support that you need or one that's going to give you blisters. So you need to find the best match for you. And sometimes that involves trying out more than one. And I think that's what happens in the clinical trial process, that you may find one that maybe seems like it's a possible fit, and you go through the process of actually doing all the eligibility criteria, you find out you're not, but you shouldn't give up at that point. If it's something that you want to keep pursuing and keep looking into other options, then think about like trying on shoes. Go find your next pair and try that on as well. And so I think it's important to remember that you're in control of this situation and you're able to, advocate for yourself as much as you would like to in this process.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion. I think that's a really important takeaway.
Yeah, and I think just to add, I mean, it is possible that clinical trials sometimes allow patients in with a slight exception to an eligibility criteria. It depends on how important that is. Some of the criteria are variable. So if it's like your blood cell count or something, that can vary week to week. And so you can get another test. The other thing I'll mention is a lot of clinical trials, especially in oncology, your eligibility is fairly, time limited. So it may be only after a certain drug has stopped working. And maybe you're on that drug, so you should be looking now. And if that drug stops working, then you become eligible. Other trials are, you can't have had an immunotherapy. Other trials are you must have had an immunotherapy. And so, as many cancer patients progress through many lines of therapies, you will sort of drift in and out of eligibility for different trials. And so it's also good to look one step ahead so you're prepared when a drug stops working for you. You already sort of know what your next options might be.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think the key is to survival is being proactive. And as you said, don't be afraid to look at next steps. I think, as far as barriers of care, I just want to bring it back. We talked about awareness and education and what those tools are at ACS. We also discussed the financial barriers, the logistical challenges. I know the enrollment process can be quite overwhelming, and maybe the tools and how we can help with that process. I know 1104 Health does work a lot with that. Physician engagement. We talked about the communication between the physicians and the investigators, which could be a barrier. And I think the one area that we didn't really talk about is if somebody's really in an underserved community. And there are, I believe, at ACS, some assistance programs to reach out to those areas as well, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a number of programs that can help all individuals, including individuals who are from disadvantaged populations from a clinical trials perspective. So ACS Acts is intended actually to serve a lot of this population, but individuals can also call our National Cancer Information Center about any questions that they have. And that number is 1-800-227-2345. So that's another resource that you can utilize. I think that an important component of thinking about different types of individuals is that some people make treatment decisions in different ways. Some people think about things as an individual and, we want to boost them as the advocate. Others from more relational households or backgrounds may involve the whole family in their decision making. And so I think we need to be thinking about that as well. So if there are other people that you find valuable in your decision making and you don't feel like it's necessarily your own decision, but you want other people to be part of that decision making as well, I would also bring them into the process and make sure that your healthcare team is also aware that that's the way that you would like to help understand your decisions and be thinking about those treatment decisions. So that's another way that we can be thinking about all individuals based on their preferences and how we provide the right treatments for them.
Great.
We are at time. I really appreciate everyone's questions, and I know there was one that just came in at the end. I sent you a note, but feel free to email us if you want to discuss further. I know there was a lot of good conversation, and thank you everyone for joining today, both the panelists and the attendees. It's a really important topic.
Yeah, it was a great session. Thanks everybody for their time.
Thank you.
Bye.